Hi everyone, it's Alexander here from the La Crosse Symphony Orchestra, and this is the time when I attempt to say something hopefully interesting about the works that you're going to experience on what I can say is an exquisitely beautiful program for you this first weekend in May. Now, of course, before COVID, we had planned for this to be, as it usually is, our spring Pops concert. The conditions under which we must work these days in order to provide you with a live performance, socially distanced, small string orchestras, obviously knocked that possibility out of the park. But necessity truly being the mother of invention when it comes to the LSO and our amazing musicians, our phenomenal board, and our brilliant administrative staff, we can truly offer you something equally fabulous. It is a program that certainly skews to the classical tradition, but is absolutely a romantic evening in musical Italy. Florence, Venice, and Rome. We start absolutely in the Pops vein, celebrating three of the most famous movie themes from post-war Italian cinema. Now, if you know anything about the rich, rich tradition of post-war Italian film that has given us such genius film directors as Fellini and Visconti and Vittorio De Sica, you will of course remember the music, which is always somehow gorgeous and appropriate to what you're watching on screen. It's kind of funny, as probably many of you know, I love almost everything about France, but post-war French cinema that is, so celebrated, the more I watch it as I get older, the more it seems kind of charming but a little trite. But you never have that problem with post-war Italian movies. They, just like the best classical music, seem to get better with age. And I think that has something to do with the genius of the film composers themselves. We offer today and tonight a miniature suite of three of the most famous themes from some of the greatest Italian movies. In the center will be the theme from, yes, you guessed it, the Godfather, the Francis Ford Coppola film, for which the music was written by Nino Rota, who had made his name being the house composer for the films of Federico Fellini. This is a work that needs no introduction to American audiences. We will surround that rather dolorous theme, shall we say, with two more uplifting tunes from another of the great composers of Italian post-war cinema, a man who actually just passed away a few months ago, Enrico Morricone. Morricone is most famous for actually writing it's impossible not to laugh when I talk about this subject, because he made his name in 1966 writing the main theme from a very erudite movie, very erudite work of cinema called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, starring Clint Eastwood. This was one of the most famous examples of that celebrated genre we refer to as the spaghetti western. Western films that were supposedly about the Wild West, but were almost always made in Italy or Spain on a very tight budget and directed by a man named Sergio Leone. Well, Morricone made his name with the signature music to that movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And by the time the 1980s had come round, he was writing film scores for, shall we say, slightly more erudite projects. And we begin and end our little triptych of Italian post-war cinema music with the theme from Cinema Paradiso from 1988 And to finish, a tune that I know you all know and love, the tune called Gabriel's Oboe from the 1986 Robert De Niro vehicle, The Mission. Well, we go from basically Rome, where most of Italian movies are produced. They have their own kind of Hollywood there to this day, to one of the other great eternal Italian cities, that of Venice. Though, be warned, many a fine Venetian will tell you that they are not Italians, they are Venetians, because of course Venice has its origins in the celebrated Republic of Venice, where one of the great, of course, centers of the Italian, that era we refer to as the Renaissance in European history. So many immortal artists and musicians have come out of the city of Venice. Perhaps the most famous of them to us classical music lovers is that of Antonio Vivaldi, one of the giants of Baroque music in the earlier part of the 18th century, the generation before George Frederick Handel and Johann Sebastian Bach. And I mention the name of Bach because J.S. Bach, as I've said many times, the greatest Lutheran musician of all time, a North German to the core, but also a man of the world. And Vivaldi's music was a profound influence on the cantor of Leipzig. More about that on another program. But Vivaldi had made his name across Europe as being the kind of court composer, the house musician, if you will, what the Germans would call the Kapellmeister, to this very curious institution in 18th century Venice known as the Ospedale della Pietà. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It was a Roman Catholic convent-run charity hospital, an orphanage, where the legend is that it was only a girls' school, but that's actually not true. There were girls and boys at this orphanage, and the legend was based on truth that many of the students in this orphanage were illegitimate children of the Italian nobility who as infants were deposited in through a little tiny window in the middle of the night. But the orchestras, for reasons we can't fully deduce, the orchestra of the Ospedale della Pietà was made up exclusively of girls. And they became one of the most celebrated orchestras in all of Europe. Wealthy persons from all over the world, really, would visit, when they visited Venice, would make a point of attending one of these very special, very exclusive charity concerts by the all-female orchestra of the Ospedale. And to kind of disguise their identities, which again, in some cases they were illegitimate children of the nobility, to disguise their identities, and also in the tradition then in the Catholic Church of female modesty, these all-girl orchestras would perform behind a metal screen. You could not see them, and their director in the 1720s and 30s was Antonio Vivaldi, who, like all such people in that position, also was ordained as a Roman Catholic priest. Vivaldi wrote truly hundreds and hundreds of sparkling concertos in that basic building block form of the Italian Baroque concerto. Fast, slow, and fast. 3 short movements, fast, slow, and fast. Now, of course, Vivaldi is most famous for his immortal quartet of violin concertos that we refer to. Well, he gave it the name himself, the Four Seasons. But there are also many, many other equally gorgeous concertos, each of them a beautiful little gem. Many of them are double concertos, concertos for 2 instruments. Curiously, Vivaldi, again, for reasons we'll never be able to deduce, I think, Vivaldi wrote only 1 double concerto for 2 cellos. That is the concerto, the celebrated, and justly celebrated, I might say, concerto for 2 cellos in G minor that you're going to hear on today's program. It is, like the concertos from the Four Seasons, an utterly perfect work. When you listen to this music, you can see, you can sense why Johann Sebastian Bach so fervently admired this great genius of Venice. Again, it's in the fast, slow, fast form. It is, the outer movements are like a gigantic composed cadenza for two cellos. The two young women who played these instruments in Venice at the Ospedale must have been quite amazing cellists indeed. The central slow movement is in the form of what we call a trio sonata, but it's a trio for four people. It's one of these curious rules of classical music, where a trio is for four people. It's the two cellos plus an accompanying cello in the orchestra plus a keyboard continuo. It is a hauntingly mournful ballad for these, like the two cellos become like two lost souls searching for redemption. Unfortunately, that redemption on earth never came to Antonio Vivaldi. It's rather unbelievable to think that Vivaldi in 1740, having been apparently fed up with his position at the Ospedale della Pietà, decided to travel all the way up to Vienna because he'd had a meeting with the emperor, the Habsburg emperor, Charles VI, which went rather well. And Vivaldi thought that he would now strike north and head to Vienna for fame and fortune. Alas, weeks after Vivaldi arrived in Vienna, the Emperor Charles rather inconveniently died, and Vivaldi would die in Vienna just months later in a state of poverty. Well, a composer who did not die in a state of poverty, but died in a state of, shall we say, controversy, was the great late 19th century Romantic master from Russia, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. He, the ultimate tortured artist of 19th century composers, who, through his emotional torture, left the world a corpus of music that is truly been loved and adored by almost billions, I think we can say by now. As I'm speaking to you, somewhere, even in this COVID age, someone is performing a work by Tchaikovsky, like Bach, like Mozart, like Beethoven. He's just one of those monumental forces in the history of classical music that enriches us all the time. Tchaikovsky, we often think, lived a full life because in the photographs of him from his final years, he has a shock of completely white hair. Actually, Tchaikovsky died in his early 50s. We'll never really know whether that death was from suicide or just a strange sequence of events that resulted in him dying of cholera, as so many people tended to do. But of course, this was a cholera epidemic, not unlike what we're going through now, in which Russia was regularly taken by storm. As I said, the nature of Tchaikovsky's death will always be a mystery, but there's actually very little mystery in his music because, like Bach or Mozart or Beethoven, in his greatest works, the ones that we hear most often, we have music that exists in a state of structural and expressive perfection. Or just to go a little deeper, if someone were to ask me what is the genius, what is the core of the genius of Tchaikovsky as a composer, it would be that he united a perfection of classical form that he himself learned from, more than anyone else, learned from the works of Mozart, with an expressive radicalism that makes him, again, one of the great expressive radicals of all time. You sense that in the very first movement of this four-movement symphony for strings, as it were, that we offer as our final work, a work that is originally a string sextet, his, as he called it himself, his Souvenir of Florence, his Souvenir de Florence, because of course in Imperial Russia, when you wanted to be sophisticated, you spoke not in your native Russian, but in French. This is a work originally composed for 6 string instruments, 2 violins, 2 violas, 2 cellos. There are a handful of immortal string sextets, all from the 19th century, most famously of Brahms and of Dvorak, and this single work of Tchaikovsky. But as you'll sense from the very beginning of the first movement, I don't care if this was originally written for 6 people. This, my friends, is a work of utterly symphonic proportions. It is a symphony in all but name, in 4 movements in the key of D minor. It was written shortly after Tchaikovsky spent one of his, by this point, as he was in middle age and very successful, he would spend his winters in Italy, most principally in his favorite Italian city, that of Florence. He stayed, partially financially subsidized by the patroness whom he never actually met, Nadezhda von Meck. They bumped into each other on the street one day in Florence and just said hello. Other than that, they never actually met. And it was under the spell of this extraordinary woman that Tchaikovsky sketched the principal themes, mostly of the second movement, while staying in Florence in the early months of 1890, the winter of early 1890. And the core of that experience in Florence is in the second movement, which is a moonlight, very, very Italian moonlight serenade, in which the solo violin and solo cello take the role of our protagonists, if you will. The first movement, however, is an absolutely taut, perfectly composed exercise in sonata form that I think Mozart himself would have been proud. Of course, sonata form is, again, one of the Baroque Italian concerto is one of those basic building block forms of classical music. It's a form developed in the 18th century, mainly in Germany and Austria, in which in one movement you have the exposition of thematic material, as in Tchaikovsky's Souvenir of Florence, 2 themes, principal and subordinate. In this case, the first rather violent, the second totally serene. Then the material is developed and then it is recapitulated. Tchaikovsky, who again, the other great contradiction about Tchaikovsky, one of the first being again his sense of marrying a Germanic sense of construction to his very Slavonic expressive radicalism, was the way that Tchaikovsky, alone among the great composers of the Russian late 19th century, had one foot in Russia and the other foot pointed towards the more cosmopolitan Europe. And in this first movement, this perfectly taut exercise in sonata form, it's as if Tchaikovsky, in the friendliest of manners, is signaling back to his friends and colleagues in places like Germany and France that he can beat them at their own game. But again, I don't wish to be misleading. This is music that is Russian at its core, and you feel it in the very first moment of that first movement, where you get this incredible crunch of a ninth chord. Mozart would have never started a piece like that, suffice it to say. The second movement, as I said, is this Italian moonlight serenade. It's also in the simplest of forms, ternary form, A, B, A. And the A section is that moonlight serenade, but the B section is what we fondly refer to as Tchaikovsky's whispering wind moment. It's like you're in La Crosse, an evening on the river in late summer, where suddenly that you feel that chill in the air, in the rustling wind. Maybe in this case, Tchaikovsky was thinking there in sunny Florence, was thinking of those Russian winters back home. The third movement, which is begun with a very simple but poignant solo for the viola, is back to the musical heartland of Russia. This is a modal folk-like Russian tune that is then, in a very straight-laced but passionate manner, is thoroughly developed with all these exciting dance rhythms thrown about. The finale is equally at home in the Russian steppe. We have a completely folk music infused finale, but again, one in which Tchaikovsky elegantly and completely develops his thematic material in a way that it would have made Mozart or Beethoven proud. It all comes together in this extraordinary climax, which is, just like many of the great works by Tchaikovsky, provides this extraordinary sense of an ending. And in this case, one that is completely beyond the proportions of chamber music. I'm not exactly the first conductor to fashion a string orchestra performance of the Souvenir of Florence. In fact, the tradition of performing this string sextet as a veritable symphony for string orchestra goes all the way back to Tchaikovsky's own lifetime. In fact, it was early in 1893, just months before Tchaikovsky's sudden death, that a string orchestra version of the Souvenir of Florence was performed in New York City at the newly opened Carnegie Hall by the New York Philharmonic and its then conductor Anton Seidl, who would soon go on to conduct the world premiere of a little piece known as the Dvorak New World Symphony on those same premises. That is another story, but I so much hope you enjoy this immortal masterpiece by Tchaikovsky.